Right now, on a hot night, you reach over without even thinking and tap your thermostat down 2 degrees. Maybe you kick off the blanket, flip your pillow to the cool side, or let the ceiling fan hum you to sleep in a room sealed off from the outside world entirely. Now picture your ancestors 40,000 years ago in the open grasslands of equatorial Africa, lying on bare ground in air that never dropped below 30 degrees Celsius even at midnight, with no walls, no fans, no ice, and a body that, if it overheated badly enough while sleeping, simply wouldn't wake back up. So here's the question this video is going to answer, and it's one you've probably never even thought to ask. For hundreds of thousands of years, with no air conditioning, no electricity, and no way to artificially cool a single square inch of the night, how did human beings survive the heat long enough to sleep at all? Start with something that sounds almost too obvious to be a real problem, and yet it very much was. Heat doesn't just make you uncomfortable at night, it can genuinely kill you while you sleep. Sleep researchers studying core body temperature regulation, including work published by physiologist Roy Raymond at the University of Amsterdam in 2008, found that the body needs to drop its internal temperature by roughly 0.3 to 0.5 degrees Celsius just to enter deep, restorative sleep. And if the surrounding environment prevents that drop, the sleeper stays trapped in shallow, broken rest, unable to reach the stages where the brain actually recovers. Now imagine that mechanism failing night after night, for weeks, in a heat wave with no relief in sight. Chronic sleep deprivation from heat doesn't just leave you tired, it measurably impairs immune function, decision-making, and reaction time, exactly the abilities early humans needed most to avoid predators, spot danger, and function the next day. Here's what doesn't make sense until you think about it. Your ancestors weren't just uncomfortable in extreme heat, they were biologically vulnerable in a way that could compound, night after night, into something genuinely dangerous. So if heat was quietly working against your ancestors' survival every single night, what did they actually do about it? This is where the story gets interesting, because the first and most important tool wasn't a technology at all, it was their own skin. Humans are covered in somewhere between 2 and 4 million sweat glands, a number confirmed by dermatological research and dramatically higher than almost any other primate on Earth. And anthropologist Nina Jablonski, whose research on human skin evolution has been widely published, has argued that this extraordinary sweating capacity evolved specifically to let early hominins stay active and hunt during the hottest parts of the day on the African savanna, when other predators were forced to rest. That's an incredible advantage during the day, but at night, with no wind and no way to actually evaporate that sweat efficiently in humid, still air, the same system that saved your ancestors' lives at noon could leave them damp, sticky, and struggling to cool down once the sun went behind the horizon. Think about that for a second. The very adaptation that made your ancestors uniquely suited to heat during the day became almost useless the moment the air itself stopped moving at night. Here's the part almost nobody talks about though, and it completely reframes what shelter actually meant to people living in hot climates. You'd assume shelter was mainly about staying warm, blocking wind, and keeping predators out. And for cold climates, that's largely true. But research into traditional dwelling structures across hot, arid regions, including ethnographic studies of Kalahari San communities, housing by anthropologist Polly Wisner, has found that shelter designs in extreme heat were built almost entirely around airflow rather than enclosure, with structures deliberately left open, raised, or loosely woven specifically to let hot air escape and cross breezes pass directly through the sleeping space. This is the opposite instinct of what you'd expect. Instead of sealing themselves in, your ancestors in hot regions were doing everything possible to stay as exposed to moving air as they safely could, treating airflow itself as the single most valuable resource in the entire sleeping environment. Shelter in the heat wasn't about keeping the outside out, it was about keeping the air moving through. Now here's a detail that should genuinely surprise you, because it involves a piece of technology you'd never associate with prehistoric humans: elevated sleeping platforms. Archaeological and ethnographic evidence from multiple hot climate cultures, including research on traditional raised sleeping structures documented across parts of sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia, shows that platforms built up off the ground, sometimes using woven grass mats or wooden frameworks, allowed cooler air to circulate underneath the sleeper's body rather than trapping heat against bare earth, which retains and radiates warmth long after sunset. Ground-level sleeping in hot climates traps a sleeper directly against soil that's been absorbing sun all day and is often still releasing that stored heat well into the night, a measurable effect confirmed by soil thermal studies showing ground temperatures can remain elevated for hours after sunset. Elevating the body even a small distance, sometimes less than half a meter, created a meaningful pocket of cooler air directly beneath the sleeper, a low-tech solution requiring no metal, no tools beyond woven fiber, and no understanding of thermodynamics whatsoever. Just careful observation that sleeping off the ground felt noticeably better on hot nights. Nobody needed a science degree to solve this. They just needed to notice what worked and keep doing it. Here's the twist that changes how you should think about this entire story, because it turns out water played a role in ancient cooling strategies far more sophisticated than simply simply drinking it. Researchers studying traditional evaporative cooling techniques across hot, dry regions, including anthropological documentation of practices among indigenous communities in parts of the Middle East and North Africa, have found evidence of damp cloth or wet sand being used near sleeping areas specifically to cool incoming air through evaporation. The same basic physical principle your modern swamp cooler relies on, just executed with nothing but water, fabric, and patience. As air passes over a wet surface, the process of evaporation pulls heat energy directly out of that air, lowering its temperature by a measurable amount before it ever reaches the sleeper. And while ancient peoples had no concept of the physics involved, they clearly understood the outcome well enough to build it deliberately into their nightly routines in the hottest, driest environments on Earth. This detail should genuinely stop you. Long before anyone had the word evaporation, let alone a machine built around it, your ancestors were engineering a version of it out of nothing but wet cloth and the shape of the land around them. But there's a piece of this story that's easy to miss entirely, and it isn't about technology at all. It's about behavior, and specifically, when your ancestors actually chose to be awake. Chronobiological research into pre-industrial and traditional societies without artificial lighting, including studies of the Hadza hunter-gatherer community in Tanzania conducted by researchers including Charles Nunn and David Sampson, has documented sleep patterns markedly different from the rigid, single-block 8-hour night most modern people assume is natural. In many hot-climate traditional societies, activity was deliberately shifted to the cooler edges of the day, dawn and dusk, with the hottest midday hours reserved for rest or reduced activity, a strategy still visible today in the afternoon siesta traditions found across Mediterranean and Latin American cultures. Anthropologists studying these patterns have argued that this wasn't laziness or inefficiency at all, but a finely tuned survival strategy, one that minimized dangerous heat exposure during the most punishing hours while still allowing a full day's worth of essential activity to get done. Your ancestors weren't fighting the heat by pushing through it. They were rearranging their entire day around it and quietly winning. Now for a parallel from an entirely different branch of the animal kingdom that reinforces just how universal this problem really is. Look at elephants, one of the very few other mammals that share the challenge of regulating enormous body heat without fur to insulate against cold, but with a body mass that generates significant internal heat that needs somewhere to go. Research on elephant thermoregulation, including studies published by biologist Michael Rowe examining ear flapping behavior, has found that elephants' large, thin, heavily veined ears function almost like biological radiators, flapping them specifically to increase blood flow across a large surface area exposed to moving air, cooling the blood before it circulates back through the rest of the body. Elephants also famously cover themselves in mud and dust during the hottest parts of the day, a behavior researchers have confirmed protects skin from sun exposure, while the moisture underneath provides its own evaporative cooling effect as it slowly dries. It's a strikingly similar pattern to what your ancestors were doing with damp cloth and open air shelters. No advanced technology, just a species using every available resource, its own body, water, air movement, and behavior, to solve the exact same problem heat creates for any large, warm-blooded animal trying to survive it. It's worth being honest, though, about how much variation existed across different environments and time periods, because ancient humans weren't a single group facing a single climate. The specific strategies used by hunter-gatherers in the humid tropics of Central Africa differed meaningfully from those used by populations in the extremely dry heat of the Kalahari or the Arabian Peninsula, and researchers studying comparative thermoregulatory behavior across traditional societies have found that humidity levels dramatically changed which cooling strategies actually worked, since evaporative cooling techniques that function beautifully in dry desert air become far less effective in humid, tropical conditions where sweat and moisture struggle to evaporate at all. This isn't a single, universal survival story with one clean solution. It's dozens of independently developed adaptations shaped by local climate, local materials, and generations of trial and error, all converging on the same basic goal through very different specific methods. Archaeologists studying this diversity of adaptation have noted that this pattern, wildly different specific solutions to the exact same underlying environmental pressure, shows up again and again throughout human history, and heat management is simply one of the clearest examples of it. It's also worth sitting honestly with the limits of what this early cooling knowledge could actually achieve, because none of it came close to solving the problem the way modern refrigerant-based air conditioning does. Extreme heat waves, particularly ones compounded by drought or unusually high humidity, still represented a genuine mortality risk throughout most of human history, and paleo-demographic research examining seasonal mortality patterns in some ancient populations has found evidence consistent with elevated death rates during the hottest periods of the year, particularly among infants, the elderly, and anyone already weakened by illness or malnutrition. Ancient cooling strategies were remarkably clever, resourceful, and effective within real limits, but they were not a complete solution, and pretending otherwise would flatten an important and honestly more sobering part of the story. Heat wasn't a problem your ancestors fully defeated. It was a problem they learned to manage, imperfectly, generation after generation, using nothing but the the resources immediately around them. So look at everything the heat threw at your ancestors on a brutal, still, sweltering night. And look at how they answered it, piece by piece, with nothing but observation and patience. Their own bodies worked against them once the air stopped moving. Sweat glands built for daytime hunting, turning nearly useless in the stillness of night. And they answered by redesigning their shelters entirely around airflow instead of enclosure, chasing every available breeze through open, loosely woven structures. The ground itself radiated stored heat back at them for hours after sunset, and they answered by lifting themselves off it entirely, building raised platforms that let cooler air pass beneath their bodies while they slept. Dry, hot air pulled moisture and comfort away from them relentlessly, and they answered with nothing more than wet cloth and damp sand, engineering a crude but genuinely functional form of evaporative cooling thousands of years before anyone understood the physics behind it. And the punishing heat of midday itself came for them without mercy, and they answered not by resisting it, but by rearranging their entire waking lives around it, working in the cool margins of dawn and dusk, and surrendering the hottest hours to rest. Zoom out far enough, and this stops being a story about heat and sweat and raised sleeping platforms, and starts being a story about something much bigger, the sheer, quiet ingenuity required just to survive an environment your body was never fully built to handle alone. It's tempting to imagine early humans as simply enduring their environment, gritting their teeth through discomfort because they had no other choice. That's not what the evidence shows at all. It shows people actively studying their world, testing what worked, discarding what didn't, and slowly assembling an entire toolkit of behavioral and structural solutions, refined and passed down across countless generations, all without a single piece of the technology you'd assume was necessary to survive extreme heat at all. None of it required metal, or writing, or anything you'd recognize as science. It required attention, patience, and the willingness to keep adjusting until something worked. So the next time you reach for your thermostat on a hot night without a second thought, understand what you're actually replacing. You're replacing raised platforms built to catch cooler air beneath a sleeping body. You're replacing shelters deliberately left open to chase every breeze instead of blocking it out. You're replacing damp cloth engineered to pull heat out of the air through nothing but evaporation, and an entire daily rhythm reshaped around avoiding the sun's worst hours, rather than fighting through them. Your ancestors never had a machine to solve this problem for them. They had only their bodies, their attention, and each other, and somehow, night after impossible night, that turned out to be enough.